Hello everyone, welcome back to my sewing and DIY beginner fashion design channel. So in today's video, we are going to do a placket. Now a placket is on pretty much any button-up shirt. So if you want to make a button-up shirt and you already have a pattern, make sure you stay and watch to the end of the video because I'm going to show you exactly how to sew a placket. Now the placket that I'm using is my own design, and I've attached the instructions from the book that I've used in the past to design a placket. It can be a little confusing if you've never sewn one before. However, if you already have a shirt pattern or a jacket or a coat, anything that has an opening cuff usually requires a placket. So I'm going to show you how to do a placket. I would suggest practicing how to sew these things in a less expensive fabric. So what I'm doing is I'm basically cutting the bottom part of my sleeve pattern. I'm going to cut it out of a cotton muslin fabric, which costs me $3.50 a meter to use. If you can find fabric cheaper, by all means do so. I like using cotton muslin because it kind of has a broad range of weights, so it can apply to anywhere from like a light kind of summer cloth all the way up to denim or twill. So I'll use the muslin. The point of using a muslin or a fabric like muslin to practice with is you want to make sure that the muslin matches the weight of the fabric that you're using. Now if I was sewing this shirt in silk, I would probably want to get something to practice with that was close to silk, because you'll see when I do the sewing of the placket, there's a lot of folding and pressing that is involved. So you want to practice on a cheaper fabric as many times as you need to get that right, so that when you buy your expensive silk or your expensive lyocell or whatever you're going to use your shirt, you don't want to waste it and mess it up by having to stitch rip it all the time. Now I'm going to follow this with a shirt tutorial. So I've already started my shirt, button-up shirt, and I'll be applying this placket, this exact placket, to my shirt that's already sort of half done over there. So if you like this content, make sure you subscribe, stay all the way to the end, because you're going to want to see the finished product, my half a sleeve with my cuff attached and my working placket. And if I'm feeling a little motivated, I might even show you a buttonhole. Buttonholes are not my favorite, but they are required on the placket. So enjoy the tutorial and make sure you subscribe and make sure you notify yourself when I come out with all these new videos. And so without delay, let's get started. All right, you guys, so I'm just cutting out my half a sleeve, and if you notice, I've got all these nice little notches happening along the bottom. I designed that because these notches match up to my cuff notches. These are also in here. This is my slash notch. So this is where I slash the opening of my placket to. Notice I've pre-planned the shape of the placket on the outside of my pattern. So that's really good if you're designing your own pattern. Usually a shirt pattern, like a commercial shirt pattern, like a butterick or something, should already have this placket design on there. The main thing for me is the actual sewing the placket on can get a little confusing. So that's why I decided to show you a way to practice. Let's get my rotary cutter out, because you know what? That's a lot freaking easier. If you have a cutting table at home that you cut your fabric on, get one of these cutting mat systems. 2 or 3 would be great. Now I've got a little hole here. I'm going to mark that. So I'm going to slash from this point, don't know, right there. Don't forget to mark your notches. On a commercial pattern, the notches will look slightly different. These notches here are my seam notches. I did an extra seam allowance here. That's not typically standard, so I marked that. So that's done. Gonna get my ruler out. This is just practice, so if you're a beginner sewer, having a repertoire of these little practice muslins will really help when you're sewing your garment together. You keep these, you store these with your pattern, and then they're like a nice little reference that you can keep with you. So we're gonna slash, this is our opening for our placket. We're going to slash that dot, right? There you go. That's our sleeve. I really like these fabric weights. I think they're amazing. They work a lot better than soup cans, but soup cans work as well. These fabric weights I got from Amazon, and they were actually pretty inexpensive. Okay, so I'm gonna make sure this thing's cut out really well. So you'll see all the folds. Okay, so all of these are indicated. This is how you can see the shape of the placket here. All right, so this is the top of it, and this is the underneath. Okay, this line right here indicates the seam, and this little flap here is going to be tucked under this. So this is the thing that covers everything basically. And this is a 1/4 inch along here. So that's my seam allowance here, here, and here that I need to press. And this is my fold line here. And this gets tucked in. So it can be a little confusing, but all of this gets tucked under nicely and folded in on itself. And then you're left with a nice placket. Okay, so this underneath is our binding. Okay, so I don't have seam allowance indicated here, but it's the same 1/4 inch seam allowance on either side, and that's going to factor in when we sew it together. That little binding strip is the strip that goes on the under part of the sleeve, and that's what the button gets fastened to. So I am actually going to cut out a cuff so you can see how I do the cuff as well. Normally, if you're just practicing a placket, you don't need to do a cuff. But I thought, you know what, I'm going to sew the cuff on so y'all can see how I do it. Make sure this is on grain. Don't forget the notches. Then you notch it here because that indicates our fold. Now I've only cut out one of each of this placket, but by all means cut out 2, and then you have 2 to practice with. which could be a nice option. Okay, so that's our placket. Now we're gonna go press it, and then we're gonna sew it together. All right, everyone, so first I'm going to start, I have my little pattern so I can find out my fold lines. Because this is, I'm basically gonna press these lines in here, not this center one, but this line, and this line. I'm not gonna press the seam allowance lines in because I'm gonna use my machine just to mark my seam allowance. We wanna make sure that we're doing the right placket on the right side. Okay, so because I've sewn it this way, I'm gonna have to make sure that the sleeve is actually the opposite because the placket's supposed to go, it's supposed to be attached to, so this part of the placket is supposed to be attached to this side and the binding is on this side, right? Because when your cuff opens, it opens like this, all right? And the binding goes underneath. So this placket is actually for the left arm. So when we're sewing, we're gonna make sure that we stitch the placket, this part to the sort of the long side and this part to the short side. So always pre-plan that, and you can pin them if you want. I'm gonna wing it, which is usually my MO all the time. But yeah, and then our cuff goes from here and then around, and then this is the opening, like that, okay? Or like that, I should say. All right, let's just pin these so that we know. Because you know I'm gonna do it. You know I'm gonna sew the wrong side together because that is the story of my life. So while it's planned, we're gonna pin it. And you'll see when we sew, it can be a little confusing because we sew the binding reverse. So we sew the wrong side to the right side of the fabric, and then the seam goes in like that, and the binding goes around it. So that's where it can get a little confusing. So let's just pretend that this is the right side of the fabric and this is the wrong side. And so we're just making a seam here, or crease. Let's just press that out so that we can stitch it the reverse. But we know that when we stitch it on, we're stitching the wrong side of our binding to the right side of the fabric. And on this bad boy, we're stitching right side to right side. Or possibly, well, we'll figure that out when we get to it because I'm even confusing myself now. Okay, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna sew the binding on first, all right? And then we're gonna do the placket. So I've indicated here the right side of my fabric and the wrong side of my fabric. That's really important when you're using muslin and you can't tell the side. So we're gonna say that this, where the fold is, that's the right side. So we're placing the right side of the binding to the wrong side of our placket, okay? So it's going like this, or sorry, our sleeve here. So right side to wrong side, and we're using a 1/4 inch seam, and we're just sewing it to where that dot is. So you're gonna have to make sure that you're always sewing on a 1/4 inch. So that's already clearly marked, but I can use this as well if I want to. However, this is gonna get a little impeded here. So we're gonna have to follow that white line for a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And start right at that dot there. Always line it up to the bottom. Go slow if you need to, but I would also do a back tack. Okay. Now, let's flip this over, all right? we're gonna stitch them on together at the same time. So this is the, okay, so we're putting the placket underneath and wrong sides are together, okay? Now we're just gonna do this one as well so that we know what we're working with and we do not get confused. Okay, so again, we're sewing from that little dot, which is really handy. This mark is washable. Make sure it's lined up at the bottom. 1/4 inches are a lot more tricky to sew on. Make sure you do a back tack. Okay, and then go. My seam allowance, my stitch length is 3.5. It's a longer stitch length in case I need to seam rip anything or sew over it twice. So what's going to happen is this is going to get pressed and it's going to get stitched this way. And that's why we need to clip this part right here. So we're going to do that first. We're going to do little clip marks there. Okay, so I've stitched my placket, both pieces, and you can see I've stitched right to where that dot is that I've marked for my pattern. And now what I'm going to do is do my folding and my snipping. I'm going to snip this area here, fold the edges down, and then edge stitch the placket onto this. So you can watch me. I'm going to turn my machine off. So you want to make sure that your stitches here end at the same point, because what we do is we do a little snip here, go right to the line. That stitch is a little short on that side, so I have to be careful now. If this wasn't practice, if this was my garment, I'd want to restitch that, but because it's practice, we're just going to keep a mental note of that. So then what we're going to do, now that they've been snipped, is press our seam open. This is going to get you a nice crease. Let's just put it that way. So all you do is pull the underside, press it open. Don't burn yourself. This is where you burn yourself here. Press it flat, both sides. I'll try and be gentler. I see that it's shaking a lot. Okay, so we've got the seams pressed open. Now we're going to turn them onto the top of our fabric. So I'm folding them onto the right side of the fabric. So this is what I'm pressing is the wrong side of the fabric. You'll see that easily when you actually have a right and wrong side. On muslin, it's the same both sides. So it can get confusing. Mark it like how I did before, is to just use Jiffy marker, something that is going to be obvious, because you'll end up having to seam rip and it'll affect your learning. 1/4 inch fold looks like. I suggest that you use a ruler if you're, so you fold that seam allowance back, and then we're going to basically, you want this, we're going to press that the other way, because our fold lands right on our stitching line, so we want to be able to see our stitch line. In here, you can see where that snip comes in handy, that's why we snip it. And then now we're going to top stitch along this seam line here. That's where our thing will get folded to, and we'll stitch along there. There's an edge stitch, okay, so lovely. And now this is the right side of our fabric, so you can see you're going to see the edge stitching when your placket folds open. So this little flap we're putting on top. That's the whole point of this thing, it covers it, okay? So now we're ready to do our other part, which is this top panel. So it's the same idea. Fold the seam allowance in, fold this over top, flip it under, and edge stitch along But this time we have to fold this little house part in. It does cover this part and it offers stabilization of the seam. Press it. This little tab here we're going to fold. So this is how we burn ourselves. No. Press all that. And we're going to do our 1/4 inch seam allowance before we fold it. And we're going to fold all those in as well. I burn my hands on them all the time. So you're going to hear me blow the steam away from my fingers, probably on the microphone. After a while, your fingers become leather, I'm sure. Already happening. So 1/4 inch seam, remember, all the way around. And we know that because it's lining up here along the corner, so that's great. And then now we're folding this one over to create a point. Hello. I always do that, I don't know why. So one has to fold on top of itself. That's where I burn myself all the time. Let's just do that. Because I want it to look good on all sides. So you can see the point is taking shape there. Now that all the sides are folded in, just get something that's straight and measure your corner. So a makeshift ruler, there we go, makeshift ruler. Let's see if I do this. So that's our fold. Now we're going to stitch along here, 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 and then across. And then this is our finished placket. So let's go look at that. So I'm going to start with this side, fold it down. I'm going to serge along, and I'm going to follow along on this line, and then go up and around, and you'll see. So, and then you'll see at one point I'm going to flip it open. Okay, so make sure it's aligned. You could pin, but it's better to practice no pinning. And then we got to edge stitch this on. Check here. You don't want any seam bulk. Look, the machine to the edge. Went a little far. There we go. So I just have been hand cranking it. If you're worried around this edge, just hand crank it. Or just go nice and slow. Oh, and I went too far. No problem, we're gonna back tack. The best thing is to just walk along. If you're worried about, if you want it to be perfect, just walk your machine along there. When you rotate around a corner, make sure the needle's down. So I sewed the placket closed. I sewed the cuff closed. So here, we need to make sure we fold it back like that before we stitch. I left my stitching on the top because I thought that looked nice. So we're gonna try that again. Now with this folded back, all right? Story of my life. Make sure it's nice and straight. You can pin it if you want. That's what I want to make sure is nice and flat there. That's where the fabric is layered on top of itself. Okay, there we go. So there's a little flap of fabric right here that I've just tucked under with my finger. And then we're going to go from one edge right across. We're going to follow the straight here. All right. Let's do a little. And then we're going to flip it over and just finish our stitching. Let's clip all these off. So you can see it's forming that nice little triangle there, and that's our finished placket. Once I just secure this. The placket is done. We can attach our cuff now. Here we go. Okay, so now we're going to attach the cuff, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip the cuff over. So I'm going to fold the cuff in half, stitch along the edges of the cuff so that I have it already lining up with these edges as well. And you can see how nice our placket opens. It's aligned here nicely. There's our banding tape, and this is where we're going to put our buttons here. Buttonhole is here. Okay, so I pressed my cuff here. My sleeve is sewn together. My placket's on. I've stitched the cuff here, and I've clipped my seam so that when I fold it in itself, I get, see, a nice sharp edge. Okay, so now we're pinning the cuff, just one side of it, onto our shirt. And this has a really deep pleat in it, so we're going to do that right at the seam here. So usually when you're pleating something, it's up to you how you want the bulk of the fabric, but I think it's better to have the bulk of the fabric facing the back. So let's sew it on so that we can see our pins. You can see there's my stitching here. Okay, so there's my stitching here that I did before, and that's my edge. So I'm just starting right there. Make sure it's at 1 centimeter or 5/8. Back stitch. Make sure you keep your little pinny thing here. Let's go. Let's go to town. Okay, so now we're going to flip it inside out like this. All right, there's our cuff here. This is the inside of our cuff, right? And remember, I designed this crazy fold in mine, so yours might not have that. And use, what should I use? Okay, well, I'll use my seam ripper, even though it's bad, to push this corner out. So that's what you want. You want a nice sharp corner like so. Now let's turn it inside. So this is the this is the top of our cuff. You can see it's coming together quite nicely. I'll have to fix this part here. Let's check this. This is looking gorge. I like how the fabric's going over top like that. See here? I like this. So I pressed this part under like that. You can see that? See this? Bulk. So see this? I'm just gonna hack it off. Get rid of that seam bulk because we don't want it. All right. now when I fold it, it's gonna sit a lot nicer. Okay, so remember I put that stitch line in right there? That's where we're folding to. See, and we're gonna stitch along. Now the reason why I'm doing it from this side, you could do it from here, underneath like that. I'm gonna fold my pocket inside out like this, my pocket, my cuff, right? And then, so I can still sew the way I need to, but then I can edge stitch, because I want the top stitching to be perfect. I don't really care what's happening under here. I want the top to look perfect. So that's why I folded it this way. I'm not back tacking right here, because what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go around the cuff, I'm gonna edge stitch along, and then we're gonna go over top. You want to hold the cuff nice and flat here and hold it onto your, and feed it through nicely. And it'll all work out. It will. Oh, see, I got some seam bulk, so we're just gonna continue. Ugh. Sloppy. Okay. Whenever you stop and do anything, keep the needle in the machine. If it doesn't behave the way I want, it gets cut. There's our cuff. Gorge. Gorge. Ooh. Ooh. Got some weird flap going. Probably pointing the wrong way. Probably should be pointed the other way. Let's try it on, shall we? Ooh.